Hello, third period. I thought I would give you guys a quick version of World War II. So when we left off in class, we began just by learning what World War II was all about. So here's a quick reminder, okay? Here is the map of Europe during this time period. The first thing that happens in World War II is in 1939, we have the invasion of Poland. Remember, Hitler wanted a complete area of just German people. So he decided he would start by invading Poland. And here's where things start to go south. So, he invades Poland in 1939. He gets the Polish people. He gets the Polish area. And then he sets his sights on two other areas, France and Britain. Now, of course, when you set your sights on France, we know from previous wars that France doesn't have the defenses that it needs. So, of course, France is going to fall. So, in 1940, we have the fall of France. Okay? Shortly after that, in September of 1940, Hitler decides that he's going to bomb Britain for a long time. It's not just going to be like one or two quick bombings. This is going to be known as the Blitz. And it's going to continue on a nightly basis where he's going to bomb Britain. And this is what Britain will look like during this time period of the bombings. So, once Britain and France fall to Germany, Germany decides, as well as Japan, that they want to set their sights on bigger things. So, first, we'll have Japan, which will start to set its sights on the Americans. And it will do what we call the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So this will happen in 1941 in December 7th to be exact. And President Roosevelt will get on the radio and he will tell everyone that this is a day which will live in infamy because it is the day in which the United States now becomes part of the war. So, really quickly, just so you understand what Japan's thought process is I have a map of the Pacific. So here is what Japan started to do during their escalation of World War II. Now, of course, you have Hitler still working on his areas, and he decides that he doesn't just want the Polish people anymore, or Czechoslovakia, or the other areas in which he thinks all Germans should live. He sets his sights on bigger and better things. And the thing that he sets his sights on is Russia. Now, you have to remember, also in 1939, right before the bombing or the invasion of Poland happens, Russia and Germany, they sign a non-aggression pact, which means that neither country will do anything to bomb each other or to try to take over each other. Well, we know that this isn't true. So what we have happen is in 1941, also around the same time as Japan is building up its empire and striking the United States, you have this happen in June and July of 41, which is Operation Barbarossa. And Operation Barbarossa is the first time that Germany decides it wants to invade Russia. And it realizes very quickly that when it's invading Russia in parts where it's ill-equipped for what's going to happen to its soldiers. So that happens in June, July of 1941. It's a very unsuccessful operation. Germany has to pull out at some point and go on to the next thing that it wants to do. But then again in 1942, it decides, well, we tried at first, but let's go after a bigger and better place in Russia to invade. And so what it does is it decides it wants to invade something called Stalingrad. And why Stalingrad is important is because this is where the majority of the oil supply and the fuel supply for Russia is housed. It's also a city that is named after Stalin. And so Hitler's thinking at this time is if he can get Stalingrad, he will win the Russian people, and the Russian people will fall to him because he beat Stalin. So we have which is known as Stalingrad, or the Infernal Cauldron. Now, this is a horrible, horrible mistake that Hitler makes. And it's horrible because, one, he sends his people in the midst of the winter in summer uniforms. So a lot of his soldiers will die. It also shows the might of the Russian power and how Russia isn't going to allow Germany to fall. And the third reason why this is a mistake by Hitler is because once he loses this battle, which he'll lose this battle in 1943, that then turns the tide of the war. Because at that point, Stalin becomes a part of the Allies. So Russia will change sides in World War II, and they will become allies with Winston Churchill of the United Kingdom and Roosevelt of the United States. So that takes us to 1944. And in 1944, we have the invasion of Normandy. So this is also known as D-Day for those of you who keep up with the traditional names. So D-Day is when the American Allied forces land on the beaches of Normandy in France, and they win their way through France, and they are able to liberate France pretty quickly. Shortly, though, before we have the 1944 beaches of Normandy invasion, you have Italy fall. So Italy gets taken over by the Allies, and Italy will fall in 1943. So the Battle of Normandy will be fought in 1944. June 6th, to be exact, is the day in which Normandy's beaches were invaded upon. We will win our way through. We will bring peace to France once again, and then from there we go on. So that brings us to 1945, okay? And in 1945, tons of different stuff happens. Probably from the start of February 1945 all the way till September when the war finally ends, lots of things go down. So let's be quick about this. So the first thing that happens is, pause. So guys, remember when I told you that Japan thought that it was invincible when I was teaching you about Tojo, and I told you that Japan really thought that they were completely invincible, that they could never be defeated? That's a lie. So what happens is in 1945, in February 1945, American troops will land on Iwo Jima, and they will have a battle of Iwo Jima. And this is that famous photograph that we all know and see where the flag is raised. Now, if you want to know the true story behind that, listen closely. Those soldiers that are in that picture were not the actual soldiers who raised the flag. Those soldiers were put there because they were the best looking soldiers, and so they were staged in that. I have primary source who tells me this, and the primary source that told us this is actually my wife's uncle, as he was at the Battle of Iwo Jima, and he was one of the ones that made it there to raise the flag, but was pulled out of that particular photo so that these more good-looking soldiers will do it. And if you Google search that, or those of you that did that for your World War II trading cards, you already know that to be an accurate story. So we have the Battle of Iwo Jima in February of 1945. And then it's pretty quiet from February till about April. April is when things really ramp up, okay? In April, the very first thing that happens in April is on April 12th, 1945, President Roosevelt dies. Now, this is significant because his vice president will take over to go through the rest of his term. And his vice president is someone that we all know, Harry Truman. Now, what's interesting about Truman is Truman wasn't privy to a lot of information about what was going on, especially with the Manhattan Project, which is important during this time period because a few months after Roosevelt dies, that Manhattan Project will come to light and it will be used. And Truman doesn't know anything about that. So, April 12th, we have Roosevelt dying, Truman becoming president. On April 22nd, the Russians will invade Berlin. And as the Russians are invading Berlin, they will get closer to Hitler, which makes Hitler very paranoid and very uncomfortable. Also in April, on April 28th, Mussolini will be executed. Now, you guys remember that Mussolini was the leader of Italy, and Italy had fallen in 1943 to the Allies. So they had put Mussolini in exile at this point, and they were housing him for his crimes against humanity. And so he will be executed in the end of April, April 30th to be exact. Hitler will take his own life and the life of his spouse and their pet dog. And so all of that will happen in April. That's a huge portion of things that occur for World War II. Then, the most awesome things will happen in May. So the beginning of May, May 7th and May 8th, Germany will surrender. And that allows for what we call victory in Europe to happen. And that happens on May 8th, 1945. The victory in Europe will occur. So that's the end of the war in Europe. Now we still have another war that we're fighting because Japan, even though it's an ally to Germany, it's doing its own thing. So it is completely just off on its own rails doing things. So we have now had Germany surrender, end of World War in Europe. Now we have to go after Japan. So the first thing we do is we decide we're going to use the Manhattan Project. And if you don't know what the Manhattan Project is, here's what it is. It is a nuclear weapons program. And basically what it is doing is it is making an atomic bomb. And not just one atomic bomb, but 2 atomic bombs. Yes, 2 atomic bombs. Okay? So we will be dropping those bombs on Japan starting in August. Now, the way that it was supposed to be was that they were going to drop the first bomb, and then they were going to wait a few more days to drop the second bomb. So they dropped the first bomb on August 6th, 1945, on a place called Hiroshima, which is a area in Japan. And once they drop that bomb, they have to push up the time period for the second bomb because of a storm that is coming in. And if you know anything about nuclear weapons and radiation, you know that that can be moving from the weather patterns. So they wanted to make sure that they dropped the second one before this storm came in. So they dropped the second one 3 days later on August 9th on Nagasaki. So we dropped 2 bombs on Japan. That makes Japan surrender. So on August 15th, Japan will surrender to the American Allied Forces. And in September, so September 2nd, we will have something called VJ Day. And this is known as the victory in Japan. Okay, so this is what the bombings looked like in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And this is what an atomic bomb looks like once it is exposed of. All right, so that's the rundown of what happened in World War II. Now, those aren't the only things that occur in World War II, as we know. There are several other things that occur. So we got to talk about some of the horrors that occur. So the first thing that we know of a horror that occurs in World War II is something that we call the Holocaust. Okay? And this is where 6 million Jews are rounded up throughout Europe and put into, first they're put into ghettos, and then they are put into concentration camps. And these concentration camps aren't just camps. Some of them are work camps, and some of them are what we come to know later, they're called death camps. And what the death camps are is areas in which these people are put to death. And it's a very sad thing. So here's a map of Germany and its areas in which all of the maps were located. So it's not just a total of 6 million people who died. It's actually a total of 11 million people. Because the final solution was, and that's what the Holocaust essentially is the final solution. And so what the Nazis did was they took all the Jewish people and they put them in the concentration camps. And then they took people who weren't like them. So people who were gay or lesbian, people who were disabled, people who were African American or different race, and gypsies. So they housed a bunch of different people. In Dachau, which is one of the concentration camps, Dachau housed the majority of Jehovah's Witnesses, which was an actual religious group. These concentration camps also housed those who politically did not believe in the Nazi regime or the Third Reich. It also was people like Catholics or Protestants or teachers or parents of Nazi youth who didn't agree with Hitler. So it was an atrocity on the largest scale. It was a genocide of 11 million people. Now, nothing can compare to the Holocaust. It's a very horrific and horrendous thing that occurred. However, America wasn't innocent in this situation either. America, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, rounded up all its Japanese American people and housed them in what we call internment camps. And so we put Japanese Americans in the internment camps in America. Most of those internment camps were housed in California. There were several camps that were housed in Arizona. Poston and Parker area had two of the largest camps, internment camps, and my grandfather actually worked at those internment camps and became friends with the Japanese people that he worked with. So we weren't innocent in the way that we treated people either, but we did not do anything nearly as close to the horrendousness of what Nazi Germany did to its 11 million people that it killed. But not only do we have something called the Holocaust, but the final solution. And so the final solution, when the final solution occurred, it occurred in places called Auschwitz, which was one of the most famous and is the most famous of all of the Holocaust camps. And Auschwitz was a death camp as well as a work camp. And so if you went to Auschwitz, you were there to die, essentially. And so the final solution included cremations, and gas chambers. And these gas chambers and cremations killed a majority of these people, of these 11 million people. In other areas of this, they were shot in mass quantities and put into large amounts of graves. So this is all stuff that you guys are familiar with. Many of you have either read stories of the Holocaust either in your English classes or you've read stories. Some of you have seen, the movie A Boy in the Striped Pajamas. Many of you have probably read The Diary of Anne Frank. These are all different primary sources, different details that we have about things that occurred in the Holocaust. And we also have recollection or recall information from those who survived the Holocaust who have gone on to speak about it. So, other heroes now, let's get past the destruction and sadness, and let's go the other heroes, okay? The other heroes of World War II. So some of the other heroes of World War II that we have a famous group that most of them came from Arizona or from the Navajo Nation area, which the Navajo Nation incorporates Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. And what it was a program for something called the Navajo Code Talkers, okay? And what the Navajo Code Talkers was an entire group of an army. It was a regiment in the army that was all about being able to speak their own language. And the language that the Navajos speak is called Dene. And it's a language that you cannot learn as a person unless you start speaking it at a very young age. It's not a written language. It's not a recorded language. It's a language that is known only to the Navajo people, and only the Navajo people speak it. And of course, it's only Navajo people who live on the reservation that still speak it. So they used the Navajo Code Talkers because it was a code that could not be broken by the Japanese, by the Nazis, by the Russians, by anyone else who was fighting on the Axis power side. It was an incredible coded language, and it helped us essentially win the war. You didn't just have Navajo Code Talkers. So you had 3 different regiments in the army fighting for this country. The first regiment was the Navajo Code Talkers. The second regiment is an all-black regiment of pilots called the Tuskegee Airmen. And this is significant to our history because as World War II was occurring, so was this talk of how are we going to treat the African Americans that we have in our country. And so this was the first time that a famous African American group took charge and did the things that it did for the war. And this was the first time, too, in which Roosevelt stopped discrimination within the ranks of the military. Okay, so that's pretty important. And the 3rd regiment that fought in World War II was the All Japanese American Regiment. And so basically what occurred is if you were in an internment camp and you wanted to pledge your loyalty to the United States, you went and joined the war. And you became a member of this All Japanese Regiment. And during this time period, they are the most decorated war heroes of World War II. That unit received the most medals. And several of those medals that they received should have been Medal of Honor recipients, but at the time period, they were only given the highest honor that they could be given per the Army, not a full embraced, a full recognizing everyone is the same type of situation. Okay, there was still a lot of discrimination going on, even though Roosevelt said not to. There still was some. And so they didn't give them, or they didn't award them Medal of Honors. After about 40 years to 50 years after World War II, these highest medals, like the Bronze Cross, or the different crosses that they were given, the different awards that they were given, were changed over time to be Medal of Honors. And so when we watched some of the videos before we went on spring break, and we watched the one about the Japanese guy, his highest distinguished honor that he received during World War II was then overturned later on in the 2000s to become a Medal of Honor. And so we had quite a few people who helped us during the war. So in a nutshell, this is what World War II looked like. And I know this is kind of an abridged version of World War II, and I wish that we had more time to go through it. But since we are rushing through it, I wanted to let you know that starting next week, we're going to go into the Cold War. So I wanted to give you this video of World War II. So, last 2 things. Out of World War II come 2 pretty well-known organizations. And the first organization that we know is called the United Nations. Now, the United Nations is what the League of Nations was supposed to be after World War I, but it didn't fully become that. So it does become that after World War II. It becomes known as the United Nations, which is something that we still have today, or the UN. The second thing that comes out of this, the second organization that comes out of this war, is something called NATO. And NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this is something that alliances were made. So it was more of a pact of alliances that said, we will fight if anybody attacks your countries. And this will be helpful, especially when we enter the Cold War, because we literally get out of World War II and go straight into another war with the Soviet Union. But it's not a war in the sense that we see the war. It's more of a war. It's more of a war like on a greater scale of like how it could become a full-blown war, but it never did. So lastly, the really most cool thing that I own for World War II. Hold on one sec. So, a while ago, Miss Powers got me these. This is a deck of playing cards that was actually sent to our prisoner of war in World War II with instructions on how to get out of the prisoner of war areas in which they were in. So, it came with a key that allowed them to be able to put this together as a map to find their way out on a deck of playing cards. And what they would do is they would take the deck of playing cards that they were given and they would get them wet, and as they got them wet, the map would appear on the cards. So she bought these cards for me so that I could put this map together, and that's what I've done here. So that's the recap on World War II. I look forward to teaching you guys all about Cold War through online learning, and I really hope that we can do the Google Hangouts soon, so get those permission slips into me. I miss you guys all, and I hope to see you soon.